Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus for the week starting on December 3rd in North America and December 4th over in the EU servers. This week is pretty rough. We're looking at Raging, Necrotic, Tyrannical, and Void, which is a lot of affixes that are tough, especially in higher keys. The Void pattern is really slow in high keys, and Voids are the emissary that I'd say scales worst with key level, so it becomes the most painful in particularly high keys, especially if you're not playing like an alliance group that all has Shadow Meld. If you have one of those groups, it's not actually a bad week at all. And Tyrannical is usually worse than Fortified in almost every dungeon this season in a high key setting. As far as Raging and Necrotic go, Raging isn't too bad in most places, especially if you have access to a Soothe from a Druid or a Hunter for the most painful Raging mobs. So we're talking about stuff like Addled Thugs in the Motherlode or Matrons in the Underon, that kind of stuff that can otherwise one-shot members of your group. And Necrotic, it's tough for tanks, but the good news is that both Raging and Necrotic have the same counterplay, which is if you start kiting towards the end of a pull, you're going to be beating both Raging and Necrotic. So it's better than some Necrotic weeks where, you know, when it's like Sanguine Necrotic, then your tank has an incentive to be close to the pull and carefully positioning so that Sanguine is well placed and not kiting too much to spread blood everywhere. But with Raging Necrotic, instead, the tank has the same incentive to beat both affixes. So that means that a well-played tank that starts kiting as this pack starts getting low will minimize the effects of both affixes. It's worth noting that the necrotic dot, is based on the raging status of the last mob to successfully apply the necrotic dot to the tank. So if you get auto-attacked by something that's raging, your necrotic dots will then start counting as raging and doing the extra damage. Okay, as always, we'll start our dungeon-by-dungeon breakdown in Ataldazar. Void Week Ataldazar is one of the most problematic Void Weeks because, first of all, there are just a lot of Voids that are in your path. A lot of them are not skippable. And the big problem, I'd say, this week is the skip into and out of Volkal's room. This pull that is not remotely reasonable to pull also has a Void Emissary in it this week. So you're going to have to commit. You're either going to have to do something fancy, some kind of cool way to not use a B-Res on this skip, which is hard to do, or you are going to have to use a B-Res getting into this pull. One way to avoid having to use a B-Res getting out of this pull is to just die on the way out and go back to the front of the dungeon. If you're going to do that, just make sure you hit the lever at the bottom of the stairs when you're skipping out. That's actually what my expert route here suggests. If you're interested in taking a look at this route, by the way, all of my routes that I'm showing on screen today are from my weekly route series over on Radar.io, so you can go take a look at the link in the description and you can download all these for yourself. There's also basic versions of these routes. Some of these may change a little bit. I may update these between when I record this video and when the weekly route series gets its update for the upcoming week. So stay tuned for that. You may see some improvements to the routes from between now and then. Anyways, Ataldazar, yeah, rough all around. This void hard to skip, although it is possible if you jump around the sides, you can get around this void. But it's tough to do. One of the problems with this strategy I have in this route of skipping out back to the front is that there's not a good way to get around this void, because if you go around the dungeon, if you go up through to Volkal and then come back down this way, you don't actually have to pull this void. So that's one upside to doing it the other way and using a B-Res on the way out. You'll have to fight one less void. But then we also have like this annoying void here. It's a rough week, and Necrotic is also annoying. It stacks up very quickly on Volkal, so your tank, unless your tank's like a Brewmaster, they're probably going to need some help dropping stacks at some point during Volkal. One thing that's worth noting is that you can let Volkal cast for 1.9 seconds before anything bad happens, so doing that and not kicking immediately might help your tank drop stacks on that fight. All right, moving on to Freehold. This is a very, very, very hard Freehold week in high keys. The combination of Tyrannical and Necrotic is actually pretty rough on a lot of these bosses. The last boss attacks pretty quickly with Necrotic, so it can start to stack up there, and your tank is going to be taking a lot of damage on Council of Captains, which is also going to be murdering the rest of your group, because the active captains are Eudora and Raoul this week, and that is, I'd say, the worst combination on Tyrannical. You're getting these like blackout barrels, which are freezing people in the middle of the room, and then the grape shot's going to kill them. Or they're, all kinds of bad things go on in this fight. There's heavy tank damage, lots of necrotic stacks going out, and also heavy damage to the rest of the group. So all in all, I'd say a week to avoid Freehold. Not too many bad voids, interestingly enough. Like the void part of the week is not as bad in Freehold as it is in some of the other places. I mean, there are quite a few more voids than the average week, of course, but you're not having to deal with any that are like particularly heinous. Still, I'd say this is one that on many weeks is a great dungeon, and this week is one of the harder ones. On to King's Rest here. Raging can be a bit of a pain, particularly in the bridge area here, if you're fighting Spectral Berserkers. That's why my expert route says, okay, let's just pull the rest of the dungeon and skip as much of the bridge as we can with some death skips. Although that means that you're going to have to save your battle reses, and that can be hard because there's a lot of things that can randomly cost you battle reses in this dungeon. Tyrannical Necrotic, pretty rough for your tanks, especially this last boss fight here, King Dazar, can really ramp up Necrotic on your tank, especially when there are multiple Raptors active, so you may want to focus down the Raptors even more than you usually do, especially the first Raptor. And depending on which tank you're playing with, if your tank isn't like a Brewmaster, they may have a really hard time dropping stacks on this fight. Outside of that, yeah, just hard boss fights because it's tyrannical. The Void pattern, not super awful in here. We have this Void that's kind of annoying, messes up the possibility of like shrouding through here. And we have this Void here that you're gonna like fight as you activate this room. So depending on which pack gets active first in this gauntlet, that might be a problem for you as well. And this Void here, which, you know, okay, so the Voids do suck. I've changed my mind. The Voids are awful also. So yeah, this dungeon sucks. Don't go to this place. Okay, on to Shrine of the Storm. Shrine of the Storm Void pattern, pretty toxic. We've got to deal with this Void right next to Windspeaker Heldis, so unless you have some clever way involving like a death skip here, which there are some clever ways to deal with this without pulling either Windspeaker Heldis or the Void Touched Emissary, but those are all very tough to execute, unless you're just going to want to run through and use do a big death skip of some kind. And then we're looking at Voids and choke points all over the place, here, up here, this one on the Tentacle pack, which is pretty tough because you've got to kill this Void before your tank can't run away from these tentacles because they'll kill you with their Colossal Slam. So you need to kill this Void generally before the third cast, or your tank is toast. All around rough pattern for Beguiling, and then Necrotic and Raging. Not the worst. Raging can be tough on like if a lot of attendants are raging at the same time, they can kill your tank with Raging Water Blasts very quickly. And Necrotic can stack up pretty quick if you're if you're pulling a bunch of Tidesage Initiates or Animated Droplets and then continuing a pull from there. So a good strategy might be like you pull the little mobs, drop your stacks after they die, and then you chain into the rest of the pull that you're interested in doing. So you pull these droplets with the attendants, right? The droplets die, and then you drop your stacks from these attendants, and then you add in these things. For instance, that might be how I'd want to pull that pull this week. Anyways, all in all, pretty annoying week for Shrine. I'd say Void Tyrannical is just really slow in here, but not impossible, but still not good. All right, now Jibber Alice. This dungeon particularly rough for Alliance. They have a lot of mobs that are very annoying at the start of the dungeon that get even worse with Raging. But for Horde, the only mob that's really, really painful with Raging, I'd say, is skippable. It's this one Iron Tide Raider. Outside of that, we can skip all the rest on the Horde factions. That makes it a lot easier. Necrotic, not too bad in here either. Stacks up fairly quickly on the pulls. But the pulls on which Necrotic stacks up very quickly aren't generally otherwise very dangerous. This Void Touched Emissary here, big pain, because a lot of other stuff is going on with it. So I'd say that one can be rough. But outside of that, none of the Voids are too bad. And there aren't even that many to deal with relative to some of the other dungeons. A lot of that, like this one, you can skip at least. So, not an awful Jibber Alice week. Tyrannical, not great, not better than Fortified, but still better than some of the other dungeons this week. This week, there are a lot of dungeons that are a lot more scary than Siege, I'd say. All right, Temple of Sithralis. Lots of things that are bad in Temple this week. Number one, Void Touched Emissaries are impacting almost every skip you'd want to do in this place. So, this Void means that this Shroud turns into a death skip. This Void means that this Shroud turns into a death skip. This Void means that this Shroud turns into a death skip. All in all, you basically, if you're not willing to do death skips in Temple of Sithralis this week, you're going to end up with like 150% count because you're just going to be pulling straight line through the dungeon and you're going to pull every single mob in here, basically. So that part sucks. That slows you down. And you don't really have any time to give because Tyrannical is a slow, you're going to have long boss fights on Tyrannical. You can't spend too much time killing extra trash. And Tyrannical Necrotic, pretty rough in this place too. It can be a problem towards the end of Merektha when you're fighting all the snakes. That can stack up Necrotic on your tank in a dangerous way. But really, Galv is just a boss where there's a lot of healing required, and the extra healing reduction and damage taken on your tank from Necrotic stacks, especially if your tank is not dropping stacks very often, if they're not a tank that is like a Brewmaster and easily drops stacks, this fight then can start to get really out of control. Your tank can just require so much healing that your healer is already, using all of their healing globals to keep the rest of the group up also. Raging, also a pain in here. Not too bad in most of the places, but in this room in particular, if you have multiple Raging Dervishes, those can also start murdering your group, so that can be a pain too. Okay, on to the Motherlode. The Motherlode, actually one of the better dungeons for this week. First of all, Tyrannical relative to Fortified is one of the better pattern. Like, the Motherlode is one of the best Tyrannical dungeons relative to the other 9, so that is good news for it. And Void pattern, actually not too bad in this place. There are some voids that are in tough packs, but you can actually skip every void in here pretty much. My expert route doesn't necessarily suggest doing that, but what you can do if you want is you can skip, actually, let me set the affixes to this week. You can skip this void and this void by doing a sneaky shroud just around the left at the start. If you're hugging left, you won't pull either of these voids. And then you can just kind of go around this way and not pull any voids by doing that. And then you can just go up here, not pull any voids this way. And then these are just big death skips anyway. You can pull a bunch of trash here if you want to finish your count, and then you can death skip here again. And it's not like those are extra death skips. The Motherlode is basically already death skipped in those spots because there are already true sight mobs there. So Void's not adding too much problem here. This is one of the few dungeons where if you want to, you can realistically pull 0 voids on Void Week, which is good for... So Void and Tyrannical are at their least bad in here. Necrotic also not too bad of an affix in here. Raging can be. Addled Thugs, Mech Jockeys have abilities like Grease Gun, Clothesline from the Addled Thugs, and like Throw Rock and Earth Shock from the Earth Shapers and stuff over here. All those abilities can be tough with Raging, so that is an affix to look out for. Although, if you're on point, if you're only getting one mob into Raging Rage at once, and then either killing it or soothing it before getting the next one into Raging Range, then you're likely to not have too many problems with that affix. So all in all, I'd say actually a great week for the Motherlode. Okay, on to the Underon. Underon Void Week, we've got a couple of interesting things going on here. One thing to note is that there's a random Void spawn here at the start, so you may or may not get a Void Touched Emissary along the path that you need to go. My extra route here, you'll see, assumes there's a Void Touched Emissary you're going to have to kill. If you do have to fight this Void Touched Emissary, it's pretty tough to actually fight it with anything else, so you might just have to kill it by itself, because adding in this pack with it makes it pretty lethal. So that is something bad that can happen. Whereas if you don't get this Void Touched Emissary, just like swap it out for an extra worm later. They give the same count for some reason, even though worms are way, way, way easier and less health to deal with. Outside of that, Void Week not too bad in here. You can either fight this Void or you can skip it by doing a big shroud around this way. And then this Void, you can fight it, but you don't even have to pull it with these Guardians, because if you single tag the farthest Guardian from the Void won't get in combat with you, so you can just deal with it later at your leisure. And then the same thing goes for this Void. You don't even have to pull it at all. You can just single taunt this reanimated Guardian here and fight the pack over on this marker. And then you can never pull the Void Touched Emissary again and just add an extra worm again to make up for that. So all in all, Void not too bad in here. Raging also not too bad in here as long as you have a Soothe for Feral Bloodswarmers that are raging. Otherwise, people are going to die. Necrotic not too bad here either. Only a couple spots where it's a pain. And there's really not anything that you can't kite in here. So... that's good news for Necrotic, except if you're fighting like a worm and a bunch of skeletons at once, that can start to be a problem because you can't realistically kite without the worm starting to melee people. Honestly, in that place, in that spot, if you feel like you're about to die as a tank, you should just start kiting because the worm doesn't melee all that hard. Your DPS can probably survive it, especially if you have something like a Havoc Demon Hunter who can just tank it for a while. Tyrannical is a real affix in here, and Tyrannical Necrotic can actually be like your tank might start just dying on Sporecaller Xantia. One thing that's worth noting on Sporecaller Xantia with Necrotic is that it does melee during the cast of Festering Harvest if your tank is in range of it. So your tank should, if they're trying to drop stacks of Necrotic during the Festering Harvest cast, run away from Sporecaller Xantia. And that way they can drop stacks instead of getting randomly meleeed while it's channeling this cast animation. Okay, Toldagor. Tyrannical Toldagor is something that we're always a little scared of, and Necrotic can make it an even bigger threat, of course. One thing to very much make sure you do this week is get as many of the buffs as as humanly possible in the buff room. If you're interested, I actually have a video from like 6 months ago now or something that explains how a rogue can do it all without getting in combat with anything, and that still holds true this week. Even with this Void Touched Emissary here, you can even get, if there's one in here, by just standing right over here and clicking on this prison bars. But anyways, your goal should be to have all those buffs so that you can deal with the bosses using them. Outside of that, Raging, something that's not too bad in here. Outside of like the casters up next to Jess Howlis, those things can be annoying with Raging if you don't have a Soothe for them. But Void Week, interestingly enough, there's a couple more... There are more Voids that you have to deal with in more annoying places on like Tides Week than there are on Void Week. On Void Week, they are at least always next to line of sight spots, and some of them are like skippable. So like on Tides Week, we have to deal with a Void here and here. But on Void Week, we have this one here that we can just skip. So interestingly enough, I'd say Void Week, one of the least bad weeks in Toldagor. Like it's better than Tides Week in terms of how many Voids you have to fight. So that is something that is worth noting. Okay, Waycrest Manor. This dungeon is going to vary a lot in difficulty depending on which door you get. Top left, usually the best one, as always. And this week, still a good week for top left. Bottom right, not that bad either, because you can just fire off like a lust on the hunting lodge room and do a pull of maybe 5 or even 7 mobs if you can handle it. One thing that's worth noting in the hunting lodge is that there are enemies that will randomly decide whether to spawn as marksmen or survivalists. So you can get up to 3 survivalists, or as few as like, I think I've seen 1 survivalist in this room before, so that can be fun. Or if you get top right, that's when the really bad things start happening, because you're going to get a Vine Twister and a Void Touched Emissary that you're dealing with at the same time, and there's not really a good way to skip around this. So you're going to have to like pull back and deal with these mobs by themselves, and then kill this Void by itself after, and that's all really slow. It's all bad if you got top right. So I'd try your best to not get the top right door. Either of the other ones I'd say are a lot better this week. In terms of which voids to be aware of in the cellar, we have the one over on the kitchen side again, so come through the dungeon on the left side if you want to avoid pulling any mobs downstairs. Or again, you can just fight this thing if you want. You know, these mobs aren't too lethal, so you can just cleave them down on top of it. All in all, okay week for Waycrest Manor. Necrotic stacks maybe a little bit of a pain on, especially some of these boss fights. Even necrotic stacks can be a pain. Rawl the Gluttonous, I'd say. Normally, the best time to reset your necrotic stacks is during the Tenderize casts, so it's important to make sure that your DPS take care of whatever of the little oozlings are up before that Tenderize cast starts, so that your tank can actually drop stacks. Otherwise, they might get very high stacks because the oozlings stack it up very quickly on them too. Okay, that about does it for this week in Mythic Plus. Good luck out there. It's a lot harder than it was last week. Hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you enjoy the series and I can keep making it. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.